At 1400 hours, on September 12, 1943, 12 fragile gliders carrying 108 men are diving silently toward a jagged peak in the Abruzzo Mountains. There is no roar of engines, no scream of artillery shells, just the hollow, rushing sound of wind tearing past canvas and wood. You are sitting inside a DFS 230 assault glider. To call it an aircraft is generous. In the world of aviation engineering, it is essentially a glorified kite made of steel tubing, doped fabric, and desperation. It has no engine. It has no armor. It has no way to climb, no way to turn back, and no way to abort. Once the tow rope is released, you are falling. It is a one-way ticket to gravity. Crammed inside this rattling wooden crate are 9 men. They are knees to chest, sweating in their heavy wool uniforms despite the freezing altitude. The man sitting next to you is a giant. He stands 6'4". His face is marked by a jagged, ropey scar running down his left cheek. His name is Otto Skorzeny, and he is leading a mission that military statisticians have already calculated as suicidal. This isn't a scene from an action movie. This is a true story. Their target is not a bunker or a trench line. It is a luxury hotel, the Hotel Campo Imperatore, perched on the edge of a cliff, over 6,000 feet up, in the Gran Sasso Massif. It is the highest prison in the world, and inside that hotel is the most valuable prisoner in Europe, Benito Mussolini, the fallen dictator of Italy. Let's look at the dashboard of this situation. On one side, you have the hero assets, 12 frail gliders, carrying a mixed bag of German paratroopers and SS commandos. They are armed with submachine guns and grenades. Their armor is the thin fabric skin of the glider, which can be pierced by a standard pocket knife, let alone a bullet. On the other side, you have the enemy assets, 200 battle-hardened Italian carabinieri guards. They are entrenched in a fortress of stone. They have heavy machine gun nests covering every approach, and they have the terrain itself, a sheer drop of thousands of feet on all sides. But here is the detail that makes this truly impossible. The landing zone chosen for this mission isn't a runway. It isn't even a field. It is a tiny, triangular patch of rocky ground right in front of the hotel, riddled with boulders and deep fissures. A standard glider needs about 70 to 80 meters to slide to a stop. This patch of ground offers barely 30. By all laws of physics, these men should be dead on impact. Skorzeny looks out the small plexiglass window. He sees the target rushing up to meet them. The tow plane, a Henschel 126, signals the release. Clunk. The tow rope falls away. The umbilical cord is cut. The silence that follows is deafening. Now, the only sound is the wind whistling through the gaps in the fuselage. The pilot, Heinrich Gerlach, fights the controls. The air up here is thin, thinner than they calculated. The glider is sinking too fast. Crash landing, someone yells. This is where the engineering pivot happens. This is where the difference between a soldier and a commando becomes clear. A normal pilot would try to flare the aircraft, to land softly. But Gerlach knows that if he lands softly, The momentum will carry them right off the edge of the cliff. They need friction. They need violence. Before the mission, Skorzeny and his team realized the brakes on the DFS-230 were insufficient for this terrain. So, in a moment of crude brilliance, they took rolls of barbed wire, nasty, sharp, rusted battlefield wire, and wrapped it tightly around the landing skids of the glider. It's a MacGyver solution, a piece of agricultural improvisation attached to an aircraft. The idea is simple physics, but brutal execution. When the smooth steel skids hit the ground, they would slide like skis on ice. But with barbed wire wrapped around them, they become rasps. The barbs dig into the rocky soil, churning up earth and stone, creating violent, car crash levels of friction to drag the glider to a halt. The ground rushes up, 100 feet, 50 feet. To the Italian guards on the terrace, it didn't look like an invasion. It looked like a silent avalanche of wood and canvas falling from the sky. They aren't shooting, they are just staring, mouths open, frozen in sheer confusion. Crunch! The glider hits the ground. It doesn't glide, it smashes. The barbed wire tears into the rocky soil with a screeching sound that sets your teeth on edge. The wooden frame groans under the impact. The glider bounces, slews sideways, shudders violently, and comes to a halt, just yards, literal yards, from the front door of the hotel. The air fills with the acrid smell of friction-burned wood and torn earth. Wood splinters, metal groans like a dying beast. Inside, 9 men are thrown against their seatbelts with the force of a car crash. And then, stillness. The ringing in your ears is louder than the wind. The difference between a hero and a corpse was about 6 inches of barbed wire. Then, Skorzeny kicks the doorframe out. He doesn't wait for his men to form up. He doesn't check his map. He sprints. He is running towards the hotel entrance before the Italian guards can even lift their rifles. He knows that confusion is a weapon with a shelf life of about 10 seconds. He smashes the butt of his MP40 through a window, reaches in, and blasts the radio operator's equipment before a distress signal can be sent. "Hands up!" he roars in Italian, or something close to it. The guards are paralyzed, not by the gun, but by the sheer audacity. Who lands a plane on a mountain? Who charges a machine gun nest with a handful of men? In less than 12 minutes, without firing a single lethal shot, the most dangerous man in Europe has seized the highest prison in the world. But as Skorzeny stands there, panting in the thin mountain air, looking at the weary, unshaven face of Mussolini, he isn't thinking about the victory. He is thinking about how close he came to dying in that wooden crate. And he smiles, because for Otto Skorzeny, cheating death isn't just a job hazard, it's an addiction. But before we understand how a man becomes crazy enough to land a glider on a cliff edge, we have to go back. We have to go back to a fencing hall in Vienna, to a duel with rusty blades, and to the moment that literally carved his destiny onto his face. To understand the man who would later hijack a dictator from a mountaintop, you have to look at his face. Specifically, the left side of it. If you look at any photograph of Otto Skorzeny, your eyes are immediately drawn to the jagged, ropey scar that runs from his ear down to his chin. It looks like a map of a river system carved into flesh. Allied propaganda later called him Scarface, painting him as a movie villain. But to Skorzeny, that scar wasn't a disfigurement. It was a resume. It takes us back to Vienna in the 1920s. Young Otto was a giant of a student, standing nearly 6'4", studying civil engineering at the Technical University of Vienna. But his real education didn't happen in the lecture hall. It happened on the Menser floor. Menser isn't fencing as you might see in the Olympics. There is no retreating. There is no parrying to score points. It is a traditional academic duel practiced by German and Austrian fraternities, designed to test one thing: character under pressure. Imagine the scene. The air in the hall smells of sweat, leather, and antiseptic. 2 men stand a sword's length apart. They are wearing heavy leather aprons and chainmail to protect their bodies, and thick goggles to protect their eyes. But their faces? Their faces are completely exposed. The weapon is a Schläger, a razor-sharp, basket-hilted sword. The rules are simple but terrifying. You are not allowed to move your feet. You are not allowed to dodge. You stand your ground and swing the blade at your opponent's head, while simultaneously trying to block the steel coming at your own face. If you flinch, you lose. If you step back, you are a coward. Skorzeny fought 15 of these duels. 15 times, he stood still while a razor blade swung inches from his eyes. The 10th duel was the one that defined him. A blow connected. The blade sliced through his cheek, laying it open. You don't hear a scream in Mansour. You just hear the wet slap of steel hitting flesh. A normal man might have panicked. The blood was likely blinding. The pain would have been searing, a hot line of fire across the face. But in the culture of the Mansour, you don't stop. You endure. Skorzeny stood there, blood pouring down his collar, and refused to retreat. The doctor sewed him up right there on the sidelines, likely without much anesthesia. The resulting scar, the schmiss, was worn with pride. It told the world, I can take a hit and keep standing. This is crucial because it reveals the architecture of his mind. Skorzeny wasn't just a brawler. He was a man who normalized extreme risk. But there's another layer to him that history often overlooks. He wasn't just a thug with a sword. He was a civil engineer. While he was slicing up faces in the dueling hall, he was also learning how to build bridges, calculate load-bearing stresses, and dismantle complex structures. This engineering background is the hidden key to his success as a commando. Think about it. A standard soldier looks at a bridge and thinks, we need to cross it. An engineer looks at a bridge and thinks, if I apply 50 kilograms of pressure to this specific girder, the whole thing collapses. Skorzeny saw warfare as an engineering problem. The enemy wasn't a force to be beaten with brute strength. It was a system to be dismantled. You don't need to destroy the whole building. You just need to find the keystone and knock it out. By 1939, as the dark clouds of war gathered over Europe, Skorzeny was a successful businessman running his own engineering firm. But the pull of the conflict was too strong. He tried to join the Luftwaffe first. He wanted to be a pilot, but at 31 years old and standing 6'4", he was told he was too old and too big for the cockpits of the Messerschmitt fighters. Rejected by the sky, he turned to the ground. He joined the Leibstandarte SS Adolf Hitler. At this stage in the war, before the horrific expansion of the SS into a massive parallel army, this was a relatively small unit, intended to be an elite bodyguard regiment. Skorzeny started as a cadet, a technical officer candidate. He wasn't placed in command immediately. He had to trudge through the mud, fix trucks, and design ramps for vehicles. It was unglamorous, greasy work. But then came the invasion of France in 1940, and later, the Balkans. This was where Lieutenant Skorzeny got his first taste of unconventional warfare. In Yugoslavia, his unit was halted by a superior enemy force holding a crucial position. Standard doctrine said, call for artillery, wait for support, flank them. Skorzeny looked at the engineering problem. He realized the enemy surrendered not when they were outgunned, but when they were confused. He took a handful of men, just a handful, and drove straight past the enemy front line, bluffing his way through. He captured 54 Serbian officers and over 3,000 soldiers. How? By walking into their headquarters and acting like he had an entire division behind him. He demanded their surrender with such arrogance and certainty that the Serbian general, overwhelmed by the sheer speed of the event, handed over his pistol. It was a bluff, a massive, dangerous bluff. But it worked. And in that moment, the strategic analyst inside Skorzeny's brain clicked into place. He realized that an army is like a human body. It has a brain, the officers, and limbs, the soldiers. If you can paralyze the brain with fear or confusion, the limbs become useless. But his biggest lesson was yet to come. In 1941, the German war machine turned east. Operation Barbarossa began. Skorzeny marched into the freezing vastness of the Soviet Union. And there, amidst the snow and the devastation of the Eastern Front, the engineer would find that his calculations were about to be tested against a force of nature that no blueprint could contain. If the dueling halls of Vienna taught Otto Skorzeny about controlled violence, the Eastern Front taught him about chaos. In 1941, Skorzeny rolled into the Soviet Union with the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich. He was a technical officer, responsible for keeping the tanks and trucks moving. But Russia in 1941 wasn't a battlefield. It was a planet-sized graveyard for machinery. The German Wehrmacht was built on the concept of blitzkrieg, lightning war. It was a strategy of precision, timing, and speed. It worked beautifully on the paved roads of France. But in the Soviet Union, the general that defeated them wasn't a man. It was the mud, the Rasputitsa. Imagine a sea of mud, a gluttonous ocean, so deep it could swallow a truck whole. The mud didn't just stop vehicles. It sucked them down with a wet, slurping sound that haunted the mechanics. Skorzeny watched as his perfectly engineered German tanks ground to a halt, their complex transmissions shattered by the sludge. Then came the cold. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. Oil turned into glue. Steel became so brittle it snapped like glass. Skorzeny spent his days trying to use engineering to fight nature. He designed heated shelters for engines. He improvised tracks. But he was losing. And then there was the enemy. The Soviets didn't fight like the French or the British. They fought with a ferocity that defied logic. Skorzeny noted in his journals that Russian soldiers would sometimes charge machine gun nests with locked arms, singing, wave after wave, until the German gun barrels melted from the heat of firing. This is where the strategic analyst in Skorzeny began to see the flaw in the German machine. Germany was trying to fight a war of attrition against a country with infinite space and infinite manpower. It was a mathematical impossibility. "We are winning all the battles," he famously noted, "but we are losing the war." Then came the shrapnel. During a bombardment by Stalin's organs, the terrified nickname for the screeching Katyusha rocket launchers, Skorzeny was hit. Shrapnel tore into the back of his head. He refused to be evacuated, wrapping his head in bandages and popping aspirin to keep going. He was awarded the Iron Cross, but his body was failing. It wasn't a bullet that took him out of the war. It was his gallbladder. Suffering from severe biliary colic and dysentery, the giant who had never retreated in a duel collapsed. He was strapped to a stretcher and flown back to Berlin in late 1942. For a man of action, this should have been the end. A desk job in Berlin. A pencil pusher assigning spare parts while his comrades froze in Stalingrad. But boredom is a dangerous thing for a restless mind. While recovering, Skorzeny started reading. But he didn't read German propaganda. He read the enemy's reports. Specifically, he got his hands on intelligence files regarding British commandos. He read about the SAS, Special Air Service, driving jeeps deep behind German lines in North Africa, destroying dozens of planes on the ground. He read about British agents stealing radar components from heavily guarded French coasts. He realized something profound. The British were fighting an asymmetric war. They knew they couldn't beat the Germans tank for tank in 1940, so they used small, highly trained teams to strike at the nervous system of the German army. Skorzeny looked around. Germany had nothing like this. The Wehrmacht generals, obsessed with their massive tank divisions and traditional Prussian discipline, looked down on commando warfare. They saw it as dishonorable. They called it gangsterism. He was fighting two wars, one against the Allies and one against the Prussian Old Guard, the aristocratic Wehrmacht generals who despised him. To them, Skorzeny wasn't a soldier. He was a thug. When he asked for radios, they lost the paperwork. When he asked for trucks, they sent him broken ones. They wanted him to fail because his success would prove their entire philosophy of honorable war obsolete. Skorzeny saw it as the future. He realized that as Germany's resources dwindled, they couldn't afford to trade 1,000 lives for 1,000 lives anymore. They needed a way to trade one life for a strategic victory. He began to draft a proposal. He argued for Friedenthal hunting groups, men who were not just soldiers, but saboteurs, linguists, and engineers. Men who could operate in the dark, behind enemy lines, wearing the wrong uniforms if necessary. It was a radical idea. It went against the grain of the entire German military establishment. But luck plays a funny role in history. Just as Skorzeny was pitching this idea, Adolf Hitler was looking for a new kind of soldier. The Führer had grown distrustful of his traditional generals. He wanted political soldiers who would do the impossible through sheer will. Skorzeny was summoned to the RSHA, Reich Main Security Office. They didn't look at his rank, which was still relatively low. They looked at his face. They looked at his engineering degree. And they looked at his file, which said he was technically ingenious. They gave him a desk, a budget, and a training ground at Friedenthal, a quiet park near Berlin. He was told, essentially, create chaos. Skorzeny didn't just train men to shoot, he trained them to think. He brought in English teachers. He brought in safecrackers. He studied the techniques of the British SOE, Special Operations Executive. He essentially reverse-engineered the enemy's playbook. But for months, it was all theory. The Friedenthal hunting groups were just a paper tiger. The regular army laughed at them. They were seen as a sideshow. Skorzeny needed a test. He needed a mission so impossible that the regular army would refuse it, leaving the door open for his gangsters. On July 25, 1943, the phone rang. It was the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters. Benito Mussolini, the pompous dictator of Italy and Hitler's closest ally, had vanished. The Italian king had arrested him, and the new Italian government was secretly negotiating surrender with the Allies. Hitler was furious. He wanted his friend back. But nobody knew where Mussolini was. The German intelligence agencies were running in circles. Hitler asked for 6 officers to be brought to him immediately. 5 were experienced, high-ranking special operations commanders. The 6th was the relatively unknown Captain Otto Skorzeny. They were lined up in front of the Führer. Hitler asked them a simple question. What do you think of Italy? The other 5 officers gave careful, political, military answers. My Führer, Italy is a complex ally. Or, the terrain is difficult. Skorzeny, the engineer with the scar, looked Hitler in the eye and said bluntly, I am an Austrian, my Führer. It was a coded answer. It meant, I remember World War I. I remember Italy betraying us then. I don't trust them. Hitler nodded. This is the man. In that second, the die was cast. The engineer was given the job of the detective. He had to find a needle in a haystack, a single prisoner hidden somewhere in the mountains of Italy, and then figure out how to steal him back from an entire army. The strategic analyst had his problem. Now he just had to engineer the solution, and the clock was ticking. Finding a dictator in a war zone isn't a puzzle. It's a shell game played with live ammunition. For weeks, Skorzeny played the world's highest-stakes game of Where's Waldo across Italy. The Italians knew the Germans were coming. They knew Hitler wouldn't let Mussolini go without a fight. So, the Italian Carabinieri played a shell game. They moved the fallen Duce from an island prison on Ponza to a naval fortress on La Maddalena. And finally, silence. Skorzeny didn't have satellites. He didn't have drones. He had rumors, bribes, and a counterfeit forged banknote or two. He spent weeks chasing ghosts. He posed as a German medical officer, a tourist, even a frantic subordinate. At one point, acting on a tip that Mussolini was on the island of La Maddalena, Skorzeny personally flew a reconnaissance mission in a Heinkel 111 bomber. It almost ended the legend before it began. While trying to get a closer look at the harbor, the Heinkel's engine sputtered. The bomber hit the water. Skorzeny, the giant engineer, found himself struggling in the turquoise Mediterranean, surrounded by sinking wreckage. He broke 2 ribs, but he swam out. Most men would take a hospital break. Skorzeny took a shot of schnapps and went back to work. The breakthrough came not from a spy, but from a love of sloppy operational security. A German intelligence officer intercepted a coded Italian radio message discussing security preparations at the base of the Gran Sasso Massif. It mentioned a very important guest at the Hotel Campo Imperatore. Skorzeny looked at the map. The Gran Sasso, the Great Rock. It was a fortress built by nature. The hotel was accessible only by a single funicular cable car, which was heavily guarded at the base. To attack from the ground would require a battalion of mountain troops fighting uphill against machine guns for hours. Mussolini would be executed long before they reached the front door. That left the air. But a parachute drop was impossible. The air at 6,000 feet was starving for oxygen, thin enough to make an engine choke and a pilot weep. The winds were too unpredictable, and the drop zone was too small. If you dropped paratroopers there, they would be scattered over 5 miles of jagged peaks. This is where the engineer took over. Skorzeny met with General Kurt Student, the legendary commander of the Luftwaffe paratroopers. Student was a professional. Skorzeny was an amateur with a scar. But they agreed on one thing: gliders. The DFS-230 glider was silent, accurate, and could land a squad of men on a tennis court if the pilot was crazy enough. But then came the reconnaissance photo. Skorzeny flew over the mountain one last time, snapping pictures with a handheld camera. When they developed the film, his heart sank. The flat field next to the hotel that appeared on old maps? It wasn't a field. It was a ski slope. It was steep, covered in boulders, and terrified the Luftwaffe planners. "We cannot land there," the expert said. "It is suicide." Skorzeny looked at the photo. He calculated the angle. He calculated the drag. And this is where he made the decision that separated him from the bureaucrats. "We don't need to land," he might have thought. "We just need to crash responsibly." He decided they would land uphill. It's a physics trick. By landing on an upward slope, gravity works with you to kill your speed. But it wasn't enough. The ground was too rocky. If the gliders skidded too far, they would careen off the cliff. This leads us back to the MacGyver detail we saw earlier, the barbed wire break. There was no manual for this. Skorzeny and the pilots ordered mechanics to wrap ordinary barbed wire around the landing skids. It was ugly. It was crude. It increased drag efficiency by maybe 40%. Just a guess, really. But that guess was the only life insurance they had. The plan was set. Operation Ica, codenamed Oak, was a go. But there was one final twist, a social engineering hack. Skorzeny knew that even with the gliders, the Italian guards would have about 30 seconds to react before the Germans could get out. 30 seconds is a lifetime in a firefight. It's enough time to spray the wreckage with machine gun fire. It's enough time to put a bullet in Mussolini's head. Skorzeny needed a shield, a human shield. He found an Italian general, Fernando Saletti, who was sympathetic to the German cause. He essentially kidnapped him, politely, and shoved him into the lead glider. The logic was ruthless. When the gliders crashed, Skorzeny would push General Saletti out the door first. The Italian guards, seeing a high-ranking Italian general screaming at them, would hesitate. "Don't shoot! It's the general!" That hesitation, that mental short-circuit in the decision-making loop, would buy Skorzeny the few seconds he needed to close the distance. It was a gamble upon a gamble upon a gamble. Gamble 1, that the gliders wouldn't break apart in the thin air. Gamble 2, that the barbed wire would stop them from falling off the cliff. Gamble 3, that the Italian guards would be too confused to pull the trigger. On the morning of September 12th, the gliders took off. The heat was sweltering on the runway, but freezing in the air. As they approached the target, the lead pilot realized something terrifying. The aerial photos had been deceptive. The landing zone wasn't just steep, it was smaller than they thought. Skorzeny, sitting behind the pilot, saw the pilot's hands tighten on the yoke. He saw the hesitation. The pilot was about to abort. In that moment, Skorzeny didn't act like an officer. He acted like a force of nature. He leaned forward, his massive frame filling the cockpit, and shouted, "Dive! Dive!" It wasn't an order, it was a dare. The pilot pushed the stick forward. The glider dropped like a stone. And the rest is silence. Landing on the mountain was suicide. Getting off was madness. Skorzeny had the prize, Benito Mussolini. The dictator was safe, confused, and wearing a heavy winter coat. But now, they were stuck on a rock 6,000 feet in the sky, surrounded by confused Italian guards who were slowly realizing they outnumbered the Germans 20-1. The original plan was to take Mussolini down the mountain in the cable car to a nearby airfield. But the radio operator, the one Skorzeny had smashed earlier, had managed to send a partial distress signal. Allied troops were likely already on their way to the valley floor. The valley was a trap. Skorzeny looked at the only other option, a tiny, fragile reconnaissance plane called a Fiesler Storch, piloted by Captain Heinrich Gerlach, which had managed to land on the short strip nearby. The Storch is a remarkable piece of engineering. It can take off and land on a dime, but it has limits. It is a two-seater aircraft. Do the math. Seat 1, Captain Gerlach, the pilot. Seat 2, Benito Mussolini, the package. There was no seat for Otto Skorzeny. But Skorzeny knew that if he let Mussolini fly alone, and something happened, if the Italians shot it down, or the pilot defected, his head would be on a spike back in Berlin. He made a decision that defied physics and sanity. "I am coming too," he told Gerlach. Gerlach refused. "It's impossible," he argued. The air was thin, the runway was too short, and adding Skorzeny's 250-pound frame to the already heavy load would make the plane too heavy to fly. It was a death sentence. Skorzeny didn't argue. He simply climbed into the fuselage behind the passenger seat, squeezing his massive frame into the cargo space. It was the aviation equivalent of jumping off a building and hoping to build a parachute on the way down. He looked at Gerlach and essentially said, "Drive." What happened next is one of the most terrifying moments in aviation history. Gerlach revved the engine to its limit. The brakes screamed. The tiny plane lurched forward, bouncing over the rocks. It wasn't gaining speed fast enough. The end of the runway was coming up, a sheer drop into the abyss. Usually a plane needs lift to take off. This plane didn't have it. So, Gerlach did the only thing he could do. He drove the plane off the cliff. For 3 seconds, gravity won. For a few heart-stopping seconds, the Storch didn't fly. It fell. It plummeted down the side of the mountain, gaining speed from gravity. Just feet before hitting the rocks below, the wings bit into the thicker air, and Gerlach pulled back on the stick. The plane groaned, leveled out, and clawed its way into the sky. Skorzeny had done it. Overnight, the engineer with the scar became a global superstar. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi propaganda minister, plastered Skorzeny's face on every newsreel. He was promoted, decorated, and given a new title by the American press, the most dangerous man in Europe. But fame in the spy world is a double-edged sword. Now the Allies knew his face. Skorzeny needed to disappear, and he resurfaced in the whispers of intelligence officers in Tehran, sparking one of the biggest mysteries of World War II. Operation Long Jump. In November 1943, the Big Three, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin, agreed to meet in Tehran, Iran, to discuss the strategy for crushing Germany. Tehran wasn't just a city. It was a sieve of secrets. It was a maze of bazaars and safe houses where Soviet, British, and German agents rubbed shoulders. Intelligence reports began to trickle in. The SS was planning something big, a decapitation strike. The rumor was that Skorzeny had parachuted a team of assassins into Iran with a single objective: to kill or kidnap the leaders of the free world on the president's birthday. It sounds like a movie plot, and to this day, historians fight over whether it was real. Here is the strategic analyst view of the situation. According to Soviet records, their legendary spy, Georg Vartanian, who was only 19 years old at the time, uncovered a network of German radio operators in Tehran. They intercepted messages saying, "We are preparing for the jump." The Soviets claimed they arrested a vanguard of German commandos, who cracked under interrogation and revealed that Skorzeny was leading the second wave. Stalin used this threat brilliantly. He told Roosevelt, "It is not safe at the American embassy. You must stay at the Soviet embassy, where I can protect you." Roosevelt agreed. And conveniently, by moving Roosevelt into the Soviet compound, Stalin's NKVD could bug every room and listen to every conversation the American president had. Was Skorzeny actually there? In his memoirs, Skorzeny admitted that the plan existed on paper. He had discussed it with Hitler. They had looked at the maps of Tehran. But Skorzeny, ever the pragmatist, claimed he canceled it because their intelligence network in Tehran had been compromised. He said, "It was a dream, not a plan." But the fear of Skorzeny was real. For the duration of the conference, The most powerful men on earth looked over their shoulders. Roosevelt was driven in a car with windows blacked out by mud. Churchill was surrounded by guards with itchy trigger fingers. Skorzeny didn't need to be in Tehran to disrupt the conference. He just needed the Allies to believe he was there. He had become a boogeyman, a ghost story that generals told each other at night. But while the Tehran plot fizzled out into a game of shadows, Skorzeny's next mission would be very real, very loud, and very public. The Tehran plot may have been smoke and mirrors, but Skorzeny's next target was flesh and blood. By 1944, the Reich was suffocating, and its last lifeline, Hungary, was about to be cut. It was 1944. The war was turning against Germany. Hungary, Germany's last significant ally, was wavering. Admiral Horthy, the regent of Hungary, was secretly negotiating with the Soviets to switch sides. If Hungary fell, the Red Army would have a clear road to Vienna and Berlin. Hitler called Skorzeny again. The order was simple: keep Hungary in the war. Skorzeny didn't choose a diplomat for this job. He didn't choose a sniper. He chose a carpet. Yes, a carpet. It was the centerpiece of Operation Panzerfaust, a mission that makes the Grand Sasso raid look like a training exercise. This time, Skorzeny wouldn't just be kidnapping a man, he would be kidnapping a government. And he would do it in the middle of a city teeming with enemy soldiers, using a blend of gangster tactics and brute force that would cement his legacy as the master of the impossible. But to understand how he pulled it off, you have to understand the target. He wasn't going after the regent directly. He was going after his heart, his son. If the Grand Sasso raid was a surgical strike, Operation Panzerfaust was a bank robbery conducted with tanks. It is October 1944. We are in Budapest, a city divided by the Danube River and paralyzed by fear. The Red Army is knocking on the door. Admiral Miklos Horthy, the regent of Hungary, has done the math. He knows the war is lost. He is secretly preparing to announce an armistice with the Soviet Union, which would cut off the German army's retreat and trap 1 million German soldiers. Hitler cannot let this happen. But he can't just bomb Budapest. He needs the Hungarian army to keep fighting. He needs a regime change, but he needs it to look legal. Enter Otto Skorzeny. His plan is simple, brutal, and straight out of a noir crime novel. But unlike a novel, this is a historical fact. He won't attack the regent directly. He will take the thing the regent loves most, his only surviving son, Miklos Miki Horthy Jr. Miki Horthy is a playboy, a politician, and his father's bridge to the Allies. Skorzeny's spies, acting as Yugoslavian partisans, have lured him to a meeting at an office building near the Danube. They promise him a direct line to Marshal Tito. It's a trap. Skorzeny watches from a parked car. As Miki enters the building, the signal is given. But this isn't a clean snatch and grab. The Hungarian guards spot the Germans. Gunfire erupts in the middle of downtown Budapest. Now watch the improvisation. Skorzeny doesn't have time for a shootout. He sends in his guerrillas, massive SS troopers chosen for their size. They storm the office. They don't arrest Miki. They tackle him. In the struggle, they knock him unconscious. But how do you smuggle a high-profile politician out of a building surrounded by his own bodyguards? You improvise. Skorzeny's men snatch a large oriental carpet from the floor. They cocoon the unconscious regent's son inside it like a burrito. They hoist the heavy carpet onto their shoulders and march past the bewildered onlookers. It isn't a military maneuver. It's a gangster hit in broad daylight. Before the crowd can scream, the truck is gone. Within hours, Miki Horthy is on a plane to a concentration camp in Vienna. He is now the ultimate bargaining chip. But the old Admiral Horthy is tough. The pen shook in the old Admiral's hand. But he signed nothing yet, even with his son kidnapped. He goes on the radio at 2 p.m. and announces, Hungary has signed an armistice. Chaos erupts. The German front line begins to collapse. Skorzeny realizes the kidnapping wasn't enough. He has to take the castle. Literally. The royal palace of Budapest sits on top of Castle Hill. It is a medieval fortress, defended by elite Hungarian guards, anti-tank guns, and minefields. Attacking it is a death sentence. But Skorzeny plays his strategic analyst card again. He knows the Hungarian soldiers are confused. They don't want to fight the Germans, their allies of 5 years. They are just following orders. So, Skorzeny decides to bluff with heavy metal. He assembles a convoy, but not just any convoy. At the front, he places 4 Tiger II tanks, also known as King Tigers. If you have never stood next to a King Tiger, it is hard to explain the psychological impact. It is 70 tons of German steel. Its 88mm gun is the size of a telephone pole. It is a machine designed to kill other tanks from 2 kilometers away. It's like driving a bank vault that can shoot back. Skorzeny puts these monsters at the front of the line. He puts himself in a command car right behind them. And then, he does the unthinkable. He commands the steel monsters to crawl, to stalk. They roll up the winding cobblestone road leading to the castle. Clank, clank, clank. The sound echoes off the medieval walls. The vibrations of the 70-ton tracks rattled the fillings in their teeth. The Hungarian guards at the gates look down. They see the barrels of the Tiger tanks pointing directly at their faces. They look at their own small anti-tank guns. They look back at the Tigers. The mathematics of fear takes over. You don't hear a King Tiger, you feel it. The ground wasn't just shaking, it was shivering. It was a staring contest between a man with a rifle and a 70-ton monster. Skorzeny gambles that no Hungarian soldier wants to be the first to fire a shot that will turn their beautiful capital city into rubble. The convoy reaches the Vienna gate. Skorzeny stands up in his car, an exposed target. He waves the column forward. The Hungarian commander locks eyes with him. It is a staring contest between a man with a rifle and a man with a Tiger tank. The commander blinks. The barriers are raised. The German column rolls into the courtyard of the royal castle without firing a single cannon shell. Skorzeny jumps out, sprints up the stairs, again, and essentially arrests the Hungarian government in their own living room. Admiral Horthy, broken by the kidnapping of his son and the tanks at his door, abdicates. He signs the paper handing power to the pro-German Arrow Cross Party. Operation Panzerfaust is over in less than 24 hours. Casualties? A handful. Strategic result? Hungary remains in the war for another 6 brutal months, delaying the Soviet advance and arguably prolonging the war in Europe. It was a tactical masterpiece. It was a perfect coup. To the Allied High Command, Skorzeny was now a phantom who could topple governments, the most dangerous man in Europe. Yet, kidnapping a nation was merely a prologue. Hitler had one last, desperate gamble to play in the snows of the Ardennes, and he needed his favorite ace in the hole. The Allies thought the Germans were finished. They thought the war would be over by Christmas. But in the snowy forests of the Ardennes, Skorzeny was preparing his most controversial mission yet, a mission that would turn American soldiers against each other and create a paranoia so deep that even General Eisenhower would be locked in his own headquarters for protection. Welcome to Operation Greif, December 1944. The Third Reich is dying. The Allies are closing in from the west. The Soviets are crushing them from the east. Germany has no fuel, no air superiority, and barely any hope. In this desperate hour, Adolf Hitler throws the dice one last time. He plans a massive, surprise counteroffensive through the snowy forests of the Ardennes. The goal? To split the Allied armies, capture the port of Antwerp, and force a peace treaty. History calls it the Battle of the Bulge. But for this attack to work, the German panzers need to cross the Meuse River, and they need the bridges intact. Hitler summons Skorzeny. The order is breathtakingly illegal. I want you to form a special brigade. I want them to wear American uniforms. I want them to drive American jeeps. And I want them to go behind enemy lines and cause total chaos. Under the Hague Convention, fighting in enemy uniform is a war crime. If captured, these men can be executed on the spot as spies. Skorzeny knows this, but he is a soldier who has already kidnapped a dictator and a government. He accepts the mission. It is codenamed Operation Greif, meaning Griffin. The plan sounds brilliant on paper. In reality, it is a comedy of errors. Skorzeny asks the entire German army for English-speaking volunteers. He expects thousands of fluent soldiers. But there was a catch. He gets a handful. Most of the English speakers can only say yes and no. Others speak excellent English, but it's the wrong kind. They sound like Oxford professors or Shakespearean actors, not guys from Brooklyn or Texas. Imagine a German soldier walking up to a GI in a foxhole and saying, "Excuse me, my good man, could you direct me to the petrol station?" He would be shot immediately. Skorzeny has to innovate. He creates the Stielau Brigade. He crams these men into a crash course on Americanism. They watch Hollywood movies. They learn how to chew gum, which Germans considered rude. They learn how to open a pack of cigarettes with one hand. They learn slang like, "Cool it," "Okay," and "shut up." And then, it got worse. Skorzeny asks for captured American Sherman tanks. The army promises him plenty. They deliver, 2, and both are broken. So, the engineer goes to work again. He takes German Panther tanks, which look nothing like American tanks, and orders his welders to disguise them. The workshop smells of ozone and welding sparks as they rush to finish the job. They weld sheet metal plates onto the turret and hull to mimic the silhouette of the American M10 tank destroyer. It was a forgery, a 45-ton counterfeit made of steel and lies. They paint them olive drab. They paint big white stars on the sides. To a tank expert, it looks like a panther wearing a cheap Halloween costume. But Skorzeny is betting on the fog, the snow, and the adrenaline of combat. At 500 yards in a blizzard, a fake M10 looks scary enough. On December 16, 1944, the offensive begins. While the massive King Tigers smash into the American front lines, Skorzeny's commandos slip through the gaps. They are driving captured jeeps, wearing GI uniforms taken from POWs. Their mission isn't to fight, it is to lie. They switch road signs to send American convoys in the wrong direction. They string red tape across roads with signs saying, "Minefield," stopping entire columns of reinforcements. They cut telephone wires, and for the first few days, it works terrifyingly well. A team of 4 Germans in a jeep drives up to an American unit guarding a bridge. "Hey, buddy," the driver says in perfect American English. "The Jerrys are already in that town down the road. You better pull back." The Americans, panicked and confused, abandon their post. The bridge is left wide open. But the real weapon of Operation Greif wasn't the guns or the fake tanks. It was the rumor. As news of the fake Americans spread, a wave of paranoia swept through the U.S. Army like a virus. No one trusted anyone. A jeep with 4 guys in it wasn't a patrol anymore. It was a potential hit squad. And then, the rumor mutated into something legendary. A captured German commando, perhaps under pressure, or perhaps just messing with his captors, confessed the ultimate objective. He claimed that Otto Skorzeny wasn't just disrupting traffic. He claimed Skorzeny was in Paris, and he was going to assassinate the Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower. The lie traveled faster than a V-2 rocket. Suddenly, the most dangerous man in Europe wasn't just a soldier. He was a ghost who could be anywhere. And the reaction of the American security forces would go down in history as one of the most bizarre episodes of the war. They didn't just look for Skorzeny. They started arresting their own generals. Imagine being a traffic cop, but instead of checking licenses, you are checking whether someone knows who won the 1934 World Series. And if they get the answer wrong, you arrest them. This was the reality of the Western Front in December 1944. Otto Skorzeny's Operation Greif had failed militarily. His fake tanks were spotted. His commandos were getting captured. But psychologically, it was the most successful operation of the entire war. Skorzeny had accidentally invented a new weapon, mass paranoia. Because nobody knew who was who, the U.S. Army essentially stopped functioning as a cohesive unit. Every jeep, every truck, and every officer was a suspect. To filter out the German imposters, American soldiers stopped relying on ID cards, which could be forged, and started relying on something a German spy could never learn in a classroom: pop culture. Checkpoints sprang up on every crossroads. The password system was replaced by a trivia quiz from hell. Who is Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? What is the capital of Illinois? Who plays center field for the Brooklyn Dodgers? Trust evaporated like breath in the freezing air. A wrong accent wasn't a mistake. It was a death sentence. Brothers in arms looked at each other and saw strangers. You look at the man sharing your foxhole. Is he your friend from basic training? Or is he Otto Skorzeny's assassin? You simply don't know. If you answered correctly, you passed. If you hesitated, you were staring down the barrel of a Thompson held by a terrified teenager who was ready to shoot first and ask questions later. The irony is that this system was devastatingly effective against Americans. General Omar Bradley, one of the highest-ranking U.S. commanders, was stopped at a checkpoint. The MP asked him the capital of Illinois. Bradley correctly answered, Springfield. The MP shook his head. Wrong, buddy. It's Chicago. And he detained the general. Think about the absurdity. A German commando operation caused an American general to be arrested by his own troops because an American soldier didn't know his own geography. But the biggest victim was Dwight D. Eisenhower. Because of the rumor that Skorzeny was coming to kill him, the Secret Service went into overdrive. They didn't just double the guard, they turned Eisenhower into a prisoner. The Supreme Allied Commander, the man leading millions of troops, was locked inside his headquarters at the Trianon Palace in Versailles. He wasn't allowed to leave. He wasn't allowed to drive. He was pacing around his office, chain-smoking, furious that a single Austrian commando had effectively taken him off the chessboard without firing a shot. Eisenhower later said he felt like a prisoner of war. Meanwhile, the actual German commandos were meeting a less glamorous fate. Most of them were caught. Not because they were bad spies, but because the chaos of the Battle of the Bulge was too much. They ran out of gas, they got lost, and when they were caught, the Hague Convention rules applied. It was funny, until the shooting started. They were tried by drumhead court-martials. A video exists of a firing squad execution of 3 of Skorzeny's men. They are tied to posts, wearing their American uniforms. It is a grim reminder that Skorzeny's game had very real consequences. By January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had collapsed. The German tanks ran out of fuel, the sky cleared, and Allied aircraft obliterated the stalling columns. The German army was running on fumes, out of fuel, and out of time. Skorzeny was wounded again, shrapnel in the face, dangerously close to his eye. He was sent to a hospital, but there was no time to heal. The Reich was shrinking by the hour. The days of offensive trickery were over. Now, the mission wasn't about winning. It was about slowing down the inevitable. It wasn't about kidnapping a president or stealing a dictator. It was about destruction. He was sent to the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen. It was the last intact bridge over the Rhine. If the Americans captured it, the heart of Germany would be open. Skorzeny was told to destroy it. But he didn't have tanks anymore. He didn't have gliders. He had frogmen. But by March 1945, the reality had changed entirely. The most dangerous man in Europe was no longer commanding elite paratroopers. He was commanding men in rubber suits, swimming in the freezing water of the Rhine at night, trying to float explosives down to the bridge pillars, while American searchlights swept the water and machine guns churned the surface. It was a one-way mission. They weren't fighting the Americans anymore. They were fighting the ice. Above the surface, the sky is burning with tracers. Below, it is a silent, black tomb. Imagine swimming in liquid glass. Your heart slows down. Your fingers stop working. You don't feel the cold anymore. You just feel the end. The hypothermia killed them before the bullets did. The mission failed. The Americans took the bridge. For the first time, the engineer realized that no amount of calculation could fix a broken dam. The Third Reich wasn't just cracking, it was dissolving. Skorzeny realized it was over. The engineer looked at the crumbling structure of the Third Reich and knew it couldn't be fixed. It was time to stop fighting the enemy and start fighting for survival. He headed for the Austrian Alps. But he didn't run like a fugitive. He went to the Alpine Redoubt, intending to make a last stand. But on May 16, 1945, 10 days after the official German surrender, Otto Skorzeny walked out of the woods. He approached a patrol of the U.S. 30th Infantry Division. He didn't put his hands up. He didn't beg. He simply drove up to the American lieutenant and said, "I am Otto Skorzeny. I demand to be taken to your commander." The Americans were stunned. They had just caught the boogeyman, the ghost, the man who scared Eisenhower. They expected a monster. What they got was a charming, 6'4" engineer who was ready to play his final ace card, the law. The war was over. The shooting had stopped. But for Otto Skorzeny, the most dangerous battle was just beginning. He wasn't fighting for territory anymore. He was fighting for his neck. The Allies wanted to hang him. They charged him with war crimes for the American uniforms trick in the Ardennes. The prosecutors were confident. It was an open and shut case. But they forgot one thing. Skorzeny wasn't just good at breaking rules. He was good at finding the loopholes within them. And in the courtroom at Dachau, help would come from the most unexpected place imaginable, a man wearing a British uniform. The date is August 18th, 1947. The setting is Dachau. Yes, Dachau. The former concentration camp had been turned into an internment camp and a courtroom. The symbolism was heavy. The air was thick with the memory of death. Otto Skorzeny sat in the defendant's dock. He wasn't wearing his SS uniform anymore. He was wearing civilian clothes, stripped of his rank, his medals, and his power. But the scar on his face was still there, a reminder of the violence he represented. He was facing the death penalty. The American prosecutors were confident. They had charged him with improper use of enemy uniforms during the Battle of the Bulge. The law, specifically the Hague Convention of 1907, is clear. You can use a ruse of war. You can use camouflage, but you cannot fight in the enemy's uniform. That is perfidy. It is considered a war crime because it destroys the trust that allows soldiers to surrender without being shot. The prosecutor argued, Skorzeny's men wore American uniforms. They carried American guns. They caused chaos. Therefore, Skorzeny is a war criminal. It seemed like an open and shut case. The Americans had already executed captured members of Skorzeny's unit for this exact crime. If the soldiers were guilty, surely the commander was guilty too. But Skorzeny's defense team, led by an American lawyer named Colonel Robert Durst, played a dangerous game of legal poker. Their argument was a technicality. They claimed, yes, we wore the uniforms to infiltrate, but before we fired our weapons, we planned to take them off. It was a weak argument. Everyone knew that in the heat of battle, nobody is stripping off a jacket before pulling a trigger. The judges weren't buying it. The noose was tightening. Then came the moment that turned the trial into a Hollywood movie. The defense announced they had a witness. The doors opened. A man walked in. But he wasn't a German. He was wearing the blue-gray uniform of the Royal Air Force. His name was Wing Commander Forrest Yeo-Thomas. Yeo-Thomas was a legend in his own right. His nickname was the White Rabbit. He was one of the British SOE's top agents. He had been captured by the Gestapo, tortured, and sent to Buchenwald concentration camp. He had every reason to hate the man sitting in the dock. He had every reason to want Skorzeny dead. The courtroom went silent. Why was a British war hero testifying for an SS officer? Skorzeny's lawyer asked the crucial question. Did British Special Forces ever operate behind enemy lines wearing German uniforms? The prosecutor objected. It didn't matter what the British did. It only mattered what Skorzeny did. But the judge allowed the question. Yeo-Thomas stood tall. He looked at the judges and said calmly, yes, we did. I myself wore German uniforms. We forged German papers. We drove German cars. It was necessary to defeat the enemy. The courtroom erupted. In legal terms, this is called the tu quoque defense, Latin for you too. Essentially, Yeo-Thomas admitted that the Allies played by the same dirty rules as Skorzeny. If Skorzeny was a war criminal for wearing American uniforms, then the British SOE were war criminals for wearing German ones. Put yourself in the judge's shoes. If they hanged Skorzeny, they would be setting a legal precedent that could be used to hang their own British allies. Justice is blind, but sometimes it blinks. The tribunal had no choice. On September 9th, 1947, the gavel came down. On the charge of improper use of enemy uniforms, not guilty, Skorzeny was acquitted. He didn't walk out a free man immediately. He was still held for denazification hearings, but he had escaped the hangman's noose. The engineer had found the one structural weakness in the Allied legal system, and leveraged it to save his life. But the story doesn't end here. Most Nazis who escaped the noose faded into obscurity. They hid in South America. They changed their names. They lived in fear. Not Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny escaped from the internment camp in 1948, supposedly by hiding in a car trunk, though rumors suggest the Americans let him go. He made his way to Spain, which was under the protection of the dictator Francisco Franco. And there, the most dangerous man in Europe reinvented himself. He didn't hide. He opened an engineering firm. He became a consultant. He lived the high life in Madrid. But the shadows never left him. Madrid, 1962, a quiet bar. Otto Skorzeny pulls a pistol on a young couple. It looks like an execution, but the man staring down the barrel doesn't blink. He offers him a job. In the 1960s, a new player entered the game. The Israeli intelligence agency, Mossad, was hunting down former Nazis. They kidnapped Adolf Eichmann. They killed Herbert Zuckers. Skorzeny was high on their hit list. One day, Skorzeny was in a bar in Madrid with his wife. A young couple approached them. They were charming, attractive, and friendly. They invited Skorzeny back to their villa for a drink. Skorzeny, ever the predator, sensed something. As they entered the villa, he pulled out a pistol and pointed it at the young couple. "I know who you are," Skorzeny said. "You are Mossad. You are here to kill me." The young man didn't flinch. The air in the room didn't change temperature, but it suddenly felt very cold. He looked Skorzeny in the eye and said, "If we wanted to kill you, you would have been dead weeks ago. We don't want to kill you. We want to hire you." It sounds insane. Why would the Jewish state hire an SS officer? Because Egypt was building a missile program, and they were using German scientists, Skorzeny's old friends, to do it. Israel needed someone on the inside. They needed a man who could walk into a room of former Nazis and be treated like a god. And so, in the final, bizarre twist of his life, Otto Skorzeny became an agent for Israel. The man who saved Mussolini ended up destroying the enemies of the Jewish state. Otto Skorzeny died on July 5, 1975, in Madrid. He didn't die in a hail of bullets on a mountaintop. He didn't die crashing a glider into a fortress. He died in a hospital bed, his body consumed by lung cancer. He was 67 years old. At his funeral, two different worlds collided in a scene that felt like fiction. On one side of the aisle stood his old comrades, men with gray hair and stiff backs, some still raising their arms in the forbidden salute, mourning their commander. On the other side, shadowy figures from intelligence agencies around the world quietly paid their respects to a colleague they could never publicly acknowledge. This is the uncomfortable legacy of Otto Skorzeny. Ideally, we want our military geniuses to be moral saints. We want the father of modern special operations to be a champion of freedom. But history is rarely that clean. Skorzeny was a dedicated Nazi. He fought for a regime that committed the worst crimes in human history. That is a stain that no amount of bravery can wash away. But if you strip away the politics and look only at the mechanics of warfare, his fingerprint is everywhere. Before Skorzeny, special forces were seen as a sideshow. Generals believed that wars were won by the side with the most tanks and the most soldiers. It was a game of mass. Skorzeny proved them wrong. He showed the world that one man in the right place is worth an entire division. He proved that confusion is a weapon more powerful than artillery. He proved that the impossible is just an engineering problem, waiting for a MacGyver solution. Today, when you see a Navy SEAL team infiltrating a compound, or the British SAS conducting a high-risk rescue, you are watching the evolution of the tactics that were tested in the thin air of Gran Sasso and the snowy forests of the Ardennes. Skorzeny didn't invent the commando, but he turned it into a celebrity. He made the world realize that in the age of modern warfare, the most dangerous weapon isn't the atomic bomb. It is the human mind, driven by absolute will. The most dangerous man in Europe is gone. The gliders have rotted away. The scars have faded. But the dangerous idea he unleashed, that one man can break an army, is immortal. History is a map. It shows us where the landmines are buried. But stories like this, stories that explore the gray areas of tactical brilliance and moral darkness, are at risk of being simplified or forgotten. We don't tell these stories to glorify the villains. We tell them to understand the machinery of conflict. If you believe that preserving these complex, unfiltered lessons of history is important, you can help us keep this archive alive. A simple like or a share tells the algorithm that history still matters. It's a small action from you, but it keeps the past from fading into silence. You want to believe that tactical genius and moral evil cannot coexist. Skorzeny proves you wrong. Stand with us. Keep learning. I'll see you on the next front line.